A 10-year-old boy pushed open a heavy wooden door, peering into a dimly lit room, and froze. What he witnessed defied the ancient, thousand-year-old laws of Arabia and could easily cost his powerful clan their lives. Yet instead of fleeing in terror, the child stepped forward into the greatest mystery in human history. This boy, the cousin of the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was destined to become a fearsome warrior whose very name struck terror into the hearts of his enemies, a caliph who ruled a colossal empire, and a martyr whose blood stained the stones of a mosque. This is the story of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the boy who willingly slept in a dead man's bed, and the man whose loyalty proved stronger than death itself. Chapter 1. A Shadow in the House of Hashim. The scorching wind whipped dust through the narrow alleys of Mecca. The city suffocated under the oppressive heat and the heavy weight of pagan polytheism. In the shadow of the Kaaba stood hundreds of silent idols, staring blindly at the Quraysh who offered them sacrifices. The air was thick with the scent of burning fat and frankincense. In this atmosphere of spiritual blindness grew a boy named Ali, the son of Abu Talib. He was 10 years old, an age when children usually played in the dust and mimicked grown warriors. But Ali's destiny was written differently. His father, Abu Talib, once the mighty chieftain of the Banu Hashim clan, was now crushed beneath the weight of crushing poverty. A severe drought had dried up the wells and laid waste to the pastures. The family was starving. Salvation arrived from an unexpected source. Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, Abu Talib's nephew, took young Ali into his own home. It was an act of profound gratitude, the repayment of an old debt. For years ago, Abu Talib himself had sheltered the orphan Muhammad. Thus, Ali was uprooted from his familiar world and placed directly in the eye of an approaching storm. The household of Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and his wife Khadijah stood in stark contrast to the other dwellings in Mecca. There were no idols here. Instead, a strange, resonant purity filled the air. Ali, possessing a sharp mind and the keen observation of a wild creature, sensed the tension hanging in the house. He noticed his guardian's long absences, his deep contemplations, and the hushed whispers behind closed doors. An invisible, powerful force was maturing within these walls, ready to break loose at any moment. The revelation came suddenly. One day, Ali accidentally walked into a room where Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and Khadijah were present. The boy stopped dead in the doorway. What he saw shattered the very foundations of Meccan society as he knew it. The two adults were performing strange, rhythmic movements. They stood, bowed, and pressed their foreheads to the floor. They were speaking to someone unseen. There were no stone statues in the room, no wooden effigies, no Hubal, no Lot, no Uzza. Only an empty space filled with softly whispered words. Ali stood there, paralyzed by the sight. He understood instinctively that he had stumbled upon something monumental and simultaneously lethally dangerous. The idolaters of Mecca did not forgive apostasy. Anyone who rejected the gods of their forefathers was declared an outcast whose blood could be shed with impunity. The 10-year-old boy was suddenly faced with a choice that would break many grown men. He could either pretend he saw nothing or step into the absolute unknown, risking everything. Curiosity proved stronger than fear. The child's voice pierced the room's silence. Ali asked a question that forever altered the trajectory of his life. Upon the answer hinged the future of entire nations and empires. In that very moment, in the dim light of that room, the fate of the first boy to embrace the new faith was sealed. Chapter 2. The Choice in the Pre-Dawn Gloom. The words had been spoken. Ali asked what ritual he had just witnessed. Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, turned to the boy. In his eyes there was no anger at the intrusion, nor any fear of exposure. His voice rang out firm, like a blade cleaving through the established reality of Meccan beliefs. It is the religion of Allah, which he chose for himself, and with which he sent his messengers. And I call you to Allah, the One, who has no partner, and to worship him, and to disbelieve in Lat and Uzza. For a 10-year-old child, these words sounded like a death sentence to everything he had known since birth. Lat and Uzza were not just idols. They were the bedrock of the Quraysh's economy, culture, and absolute power. To renounce them meant challenging the entirety of Arabia. Ali answered honestly, devoid of childish bravado. I have not heard of this until today, and I cannot make a decision until I speak with Abu Talib. Seeking his father was a natural defensive instinct. Abu Talib remained his ultimate authority, the protector of their lineage. But the secret revealed to Ali was far too dangerous to share. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, understood the fragility of the moment. The new faith was not yet strong enough to openly withstand the wrath of Mecca. The revelations had only just begun to descend. He spoke words that placed a heavy, adult burden onto the child's shoulders. O Ali, even if you do not accept Islam, keep this a secret. Night fell, the longest night in the young Hashemite's life. He lay on his stiff, woven mat, listening to the sounds of the sleeping city. Somewhere in the distance, dogs barked, and the night guards near the Kaaba murmured to one another. A hurricane raged in the boy's mind. To go to his father meant shifting the responsibility, but it also meant betraying the trust of the man who had sheltered him from starvation. Conversely, to accept the words of Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, meant stepping onto a path that led into total darkness. That silent night became the crucible that forged the character of the future great warrior and caliph. In the quiet darkness, alone with his thoughts, Ali grasped what took others years to understand. The rejection of stone idols crystallized in his mind with absolute clarity. Why worship what was carved by human hands? How could a lifeless piece of stone dictate the fates of men? The truth began to sprout through the thick, hardened crust of ancient pagan traditions. The Creator guided Ali to the straight path before the sun even rose. By morning, his decision was made. It was firm, calculated, and irrevocable. He did not go to Abu Talib. He went to Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. In the quiet of the morning, as Mecca was just beginning to stir, Ali testified to his faith. He acknowledged the one God and the prophetic mission of his guardian. It happened on a Tuesday, just one day after the Prophet received his first revelation on a Monday. Anas ibn Malik would later confirm this incredible fact. The 10-year-old boy became one of the very first people on earth to embrace Islam, preceding gray-haired sages and powerful tribal chieftains. But this profound step required colossal endurance. Accepting the faith was merely the beginning of his trials. He now had to live a double life. By day, he was an ordinary boy of the Banu Hashim. By night, he transformed into a secret follower of a forbidden religion. Ali hid his beliefs, fearing his father's wrath. Every single day harbored the threat of discovery. A careless glance or an accidental slip of the tongue during pagan festivities could be fatal. In this agonizing tension, balancing on a razor's edge, the iron will of the man destined to become the sword of Islam was forged. Chapter 3. In the Bed of Death. Secrets inevitably find the light. The truth concealed within the walls of Muhammad's home, peace and blessings be upon him, soon spilled out into the streets of Mecca. Abu Talib learned of his son's choice. A confrontation between father and son could have ended in disaster for the young Muslim, but the old Hashemite chieftain displayed remarkable wisdom. He did not force Ali to renounce his faith. Instead, he commanded him to remain steadfast on his chosen path. With his father's tacit approval, Ali dropped his mask. He began to practice his religion openly before the eyes of all Mecca, sparking outrage and bewilderment among his former tribesmen. Years passed. The boy grew into a robust, fearless young man. The atmosphere in the city reached a boiling point. The Quraysh, whose wealth and authority relied entirely on idolatry, escalated from mockery to outright terror. Muslims were tortured, murdered, and starved in the mountain passes. Yet the ultimate prize for the pagans remained the Prophet himself, peace and blessings be upon him. One night their hatred reached its zenith. Tribal leaders convened a secret council and made a horrific decision. Muhammad must die. To prevent a blood feud, they selected one warrior from each clan. Together they would strike the fatal blow, sharing the guilt equally among all tribes. Under the cover of darkness, the assassins encircled the home of the messenger of God. Naked blades gleamed dimly in their hands. They waited for dawn to break in and commit the murder. Inside the house, the tension was suffocating. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, had received a divine revelation warning him of the impending plot. The time had come to leave Mecca. It was time for the hijrah, the migration to Medina. But how could he slip through a tightening noose of armed killers? He needed someone willing to sacrifice himself to save the mission. The choice fell upon Ali. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, turned to the young man with an order that, to anyone else, would have sounded like a death sentence. Lie in his bed and cover himself with his green mantle. The strategy was brutally precise. As the assassins peered through the cracks of the house, they would see a sleeping figure and mistake Ali for Muhammad. This would buy the Prophet precious time to escape. Ali did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He walked to the bed where the messenger of God usually rested and lay down. The hard mat felt softer than down feathers. He pulled the heavy cloak over his body, feeling its weight settle upon him. In that moment, he absorbed the full brunt of the hatred gathering just outside the walls. The young man was left utterly alone with an inescapable, approaching doom. The night dragged on endlessly. The rustle of footsteps, the heavy breathing of the conspirators, and the clinking of weapons drifted in from the outside. Ali lay completely still. He knew that at any second the door could be kicked in, and a storm of blades would descend upon him in the dark. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his mind remained icy and focused. In that bed, surrounded by killers, he was taking the ultimate test of his life, a test of absolute reliance on the Almighty. He fully understood that his body was serving as a human shield, a decoy to draw their deadly focus. With the first rays of the sun, the door burst open with a loud crack. Furious Qurayshi warriors stormed into the house, ready to tear the sleeper to pieces. They violently ripped away the green mantle and froze in absolute shock. Young Ali stared back at them from the bed, their rage instantly mixed with profound disbelief. Their flawless plan had collapsed in ruins. Their primary target had slipped the trap right while they stood guard over the boy. That night, Ali cheated death itself, proving that the faith born in a 10-year-old boy in a shadowy room had hardened into steel armor that not even the finest blades of Mecca could pierce. Chapter 4. Blood on the Burning Sand. The Quraysh awoke from their shock with terrifying fury. The realization that they had let their primary target slip right through their fingers unleashed their rage onto Ali. He was subjected to brutal interrogations, threats, and demands to reveal the fugitive's escape route. Yet the young man remained as silent as stone. He had flawlessly executed his first task, buying precious time. Now a second, equally daunting mission lay before him. Mecca was in absolute turmoil. Search parties scoured the surrounding deserts, hunting for the escapees. Ali was left entirely alone in the heart of enemy territory. He needed not only to survive, but to complete the tasks entrusted to him by the Prophet. Peace and blessings be upon him. A stunning paradox of ancient Arabia was that the very same men who thirsted to kill Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, trusted him with their most valuable possessions. He safeguarded their savings, jewels, and vital documents. He was known as Al-Amin, the trustworthy. And now Ali, risking being torn apart by an angry mob, had to return this wealth to the very men who had held knives to his throat just hours before. The days in Mecca dragged on under a suffocating cloud of tension. The young man walked the streets, methodically settling debts and returning the entrusted goods. Every encounter was a defiance. He endured the hateful glares and the vicious whispers behind his back with unwavering stoicism. When the final item was returned to its rightful owner, Ali knew his mission in this hostile city was complete. It was time to join his brothers in faith. It was time to march to Medina. But he could not join a caravan. He could not openly purchase a camel. The Quraysh would never miss an opportunity to murder him in the open desert. There was only one way out: to go on foot, evading patrols, and taking the harshest, most treacherous paths. The distance from Mecca to Medina spanned nearly 400 kilometers. 400 kilometers of scorching sand, jagged rocks, relentless daytime sun, and freezing night winds. Ali set out into the wasteland alone. His supplies were meager, his clothing thin. Day after day he pushed through the desolate expanse. The sun mercilessly scorched his skin, and the wind whipped his face with sand like tiny, stinging needles. But his greatest agony came from the jagged terrain. Without proper footwear, leaping over boulders and navigating dry riverbeds, his feet were torn to shreds. His soles swelled, becoming a massive, pulsating, bloody wound. Every single step sent a jolt of excruciating pain through his entire body. He traveled mostly by night when the temperature dropped, navigating by the stars. During the day, he sought whatever scarce shade the ravines offered, trying to survive the blistering heat. His journey was saturated with an agony that epic ballads often ignore. This was not a clash of steel against an armed foe, but a brutal, silent war against the absolute limits of human endurance. His bleeding feet left dark trails in the sand, quickly erased by the dry desert wind. Finally, the palm groves of Medina appeared on the horizon, the city of refuge. Emaciated, exhausted, and barely able to stand, the young man crossed the invisible threshold separating his past from his future. Word of his arrival quickly reached the prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. The reunion of the two cousins, after such a deadly separation, was a moment of profound, overwhelming emotion. The messenger of God saw Ali's condition. He looked down at the young man's feet, now a bloody, mangled ruin from the grueling trek. His emotions broke through. The prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, embraced his cousin and wept. Tears of deep compassion fell onto Ali's dust-covered clothes. Then, something happened that etched itself permanently into the young warrior's memory. The prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, applied his saliva to his hands and gently wiped the battered, bleeding feet of his companion, fervently praying for his healing. In that very second, the agonizing, maddening pain of the past several days began to vanish. The open wounds closed. The severe swelling subsided. This miraculous healing was a divine reward for his unimaginable loyalty and sacrifice. Following that sincere prayer, Ali's feet never pained him again, right up until the day he left this world. He had arrived in Medina on foot, trailing blood, but it was here, on this new soil, that he was destined to rise to his full height and forge himself into a living legend. Chapter 5. The Birth of the Lion of Allah. Medina was not merely a sanctuary for Ali. It became the forge that shaped a warrior without equal. The exhausted young man who had arrived from Mecca with bleeding feet disappeared. In his place stood a formidable man whose very name made the enemies of Islam grip their sword hilts until their knuckles turned white. In Medina, he built a family, marrying Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, and becoming the father of his grandsons. Yet his ultimate calling lay on the battlefield. The era of diplomacy and peaceful persuasion was over. Pagan Arabia had declared a war of total annihilation against the nascent community. In response, Medina unsheathed its swords. The first great clash took place at the wells of Badr. The Muslims were outnumbered 3-1. The air hummed with lethal tension. Following ancient Arabian custom, The battle commenced with duels between the greatest champions. Three heavily armored giants stepped forward from the Quraysh ranks. Three Muslims walked out to meet them. Among them was Ali. He was barely in his early 20s. He moved with the fluid grace of an apex predator, his eyes cold and meticulously calculating. The duel was brief. Ali's sword flashed upwards and crashed down, felling the seasoned Meccan veteran. On that day at Badr, he fought with a ferocity that defied logical explanation. He carved through enemy lines without fatigue, his blade catching the blinding sun as he reaped a bloody harvest. Badr was his baptism by fire, the proving ground where he demonstrated that his profound faith was backed by the devastating power of his arms. Badr was followed by Uhud, a battle that became a grueling, brutal test for the Muslims. When the archers abandoned their posts, the tide of the battle viciously turned. The Quraysh army struck from the rear. Pure panic erupted in the Muslim ranks. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was suddenly encircled by enemies desperate to strike him down. In that absolute critical moment, when the fate of Islam hung by a thread, Ali's figure materialized in the very center of the bloody meat grinder. He did not retreat a single inch. He transformed into an impenetrable living shield, deflecting the lethal blows raining down from every direction. On that day at Uhud, he suffered 16 severe, agonizing wounds. His body was a map of deep gashes, yet he kept fighting, fiercely protecting the messenger of God until the enemy finally fell back. It was precisely then that the legend of his inhuman resilience and absolute fearlessness was born. Ali fought in almost every major conflict of early Islam: the Battle of the Trench, the conquest of Khaybar, where he ripped a massive, heavy iron fortress door off its hinges and wielded it as a shield, and the triumphant return to conquer Mecca. He missed only the expedition to Tabuk. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, had ordered him to stay behind in Medina to protect his family in the city. For a warrior accustomed to leading the vanguard, staying behind was a bitter pill to swallow. But Ali obeyed without hesitation, proving that absolute obedience to the Prophet mattered far more to him than personal glory. Astoundingly, years of horrific, blood-soaked warfare did not harden his soul. Alongside his phenomenal physical courage, he possessed an intellect of incredible depth. Ali became one of the most prominent and brilliant scholars of his era. People sought him out to resolve the most complex, tangled theological and legal disputes. The man whose hands were heavily calloused from gripping a sword hilt delivered speeches that stunned audiences with their soaring eloquence and profound wisdom. Two contrasting forces coexisted perfectly within him: the savage fury of a lion on the battlefield and the absolute humility of an ascetic in prayer. This unique, potent fusion of raw power and brilliant intellect made him one of the most towering figures in the expanding Islamic empire, setting the stage for the most excruciating trial of his life: the crushing burden of supreme power. Chapter 6: The Burden of the Caliphate and the Poisoned Blade. Medina was no longer a besieged outpost. It had evolved into the beating heart of a colossal empire. The Islamic Caliphate stretched vast distances, from the blazing sands of Arabia to the fertile green valleys of Persia and Egypt. But as the borders expanded outward, a venomous internal tension grew within. In the 35th year of the Hijra, on a Friday, the 25th day of the month of Dhu al-Hijjah, the world violently shuddered. Caliph Uthman was brutally murdered by conspirators right inside his own home. The state teetered on the very edge of the abyss, ready to plunge into total, chaotic anarchy. In this dark, critical hour, the terrified and fractured Muslim community turned their desperate eyes to one man. They looked to the one who had stood as the absolute vanguard of the faith since he was 10 years old. The man whose very name inspired awe. They turned to Ali. Inside the Prophet's mosque, peace and blessings be upon him, thousands rushed to pledge their allegiance to him. Thus, the first boy to ever accept Islam became the fourth rightly guided caliph. But this absolute power was no gift. It proved to be the most grueling agony of his entire life, a curse that tore the community apart. Ali's reign fell during the catastrophic era of the Great Fitna, the devastating civil war. Instead of fighting external enemies, whom he had so masterfully crushed in his youth, he was forced to battle rampant betrayal, vicious political intrigue, and an insatiable lust for power deep within the Ummah itself. His uncompromising, rigid honesty and his fierce demands for justice from his governors ignited massive rebellions. The flames of civil war engulfed the lands. The very sword that had once shielded Islam from pagans was now, tragically, forced to strike down men who called themselves Muslims. The Battle of the Camel, the Battle of Siffin, the dusty battlefields were soaked with the blood of former brothers. Ali watched in deep sorrow as the unity he had sacrificed his entire life to build crumbled before his eyes. And within the burning forge of these fratricidal wars, a new, terrifying entity was born: the Kharijites. They were radical religious fanatics, utterly blinded by their own distorted interpretation of the truth. They violently broke away from the caliph's army, declaring anyone who did not share their extreme, rigid views to be an apostate deserving of death. They were zealous, merciless, and thirsted for the blood of the man they had hailed as their leader only days before. Ali's fate was sealed in the dark, whispering shadows of a conspiracy. Three fanatical Kharijites swore a blood oath to assassinate the three primary political leaders of the era. The man who volunteered to butcher the caliph was named Ibn Muljam. He prepared for the assassination with chilling, cold-blooded methodology. For an entire month, he soaked his blade in a lethal, concentrated poison, ensuring that even the slightest scratch would guarantee a painful death. The 40th year of the Hijra arrived. It was the early, quiet morning of the 19th day of the month of Ramadan. Kufa, the new sprawling capital of the caliphate, was still deep in sleep. The air was crisp and cool. Ali walked toward the great mosque for the dawn prayer, gently waking the sleeping people along his path. He walked entirely without guards, absolutely certain that his life rested solely in the hands of the Almighty. Yet waiting for him in the dim, quiet shadows of the mosque was death itself. As the caliph bowed low, placing his forehead on the ground in total submission to the Creator, the assassin slipped from the darkness. The poisoned blade violently hissed through the air and came down with a sickening thud upon the head of the praying Ali. The toxic venom instantly surged into his bloodstream. The fatal strike was not delivered in open, honorable combat, but from behind, in a cowardly ambush, during a moment of supreme vulnerability in divine worship. The legendary warrior who had never lost a single duel, whose battle-hardened body bore the heavy scars of 16 strikes from Uhud, was felled by the treacherous hand of a fanatic. He lingered for several agonizing days, suffering from the vicious effects of the poison. Yet even on his deathbed, his justice remained absolute. He strictly forbade the torture of his assassin, commanding only that the man be given a single, equal, retaliatory strike if the wound proved fatal. Thus ended the life of the boy who had once dared to risk absolutely everything for an unknown faith in a dimly lit Meccan room. The man who willingly lay in a deathbed, who shredded his feet on boiling desert sands, and who, until his very last ragged breath, remained flawlessly loyal to the teachings of his guardian and prophet. Ali's blood soaked deeply into the cold stone floor of the mosque, forever closing the glorious chapter of the rightly guided caliphs, and leaving behind a jagged, bleeding scar in history that has never truly healed.